Hello, and today we're going to be reviewing the Hyper 20-volt 8-inch pole saw model number HT21-401-003-08. I think they got their naming scheme from a Pentagon weapon project revisement, but whatever, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first up we've got the battery slot located near the rear of the tool. On the base near the handle we have the battery slot, which is actually, well, surprisingly good on this particular tool. There is next to no looseness or play to speak of, and the battery fits in nice and securely without any sort of worries about it dropping the battery. When it comes to battery life on this particular tool, I was able to get about 20 cuts and finish all the maintenance I needed to do around our property using a 1.5 amp hour battery, and the battery still had charge when I had finished. So I believe that as long as you don't have a forest on your property, the included 2 amp hour battery should be more than enough for, well, whatever purposes you need, as long as it's just basic upkeep around your property. So really no complaints here, and everything gets a pass. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the grip. Now the rear grip on this particular tool is where the trigger is located and features a nice rubberized texture with a good pattern that has been molded into it, which will help you maintain your grip on this particular tool. It is easy to maintain your grip on this particular tool because the diameter of the grip is of a decent size, so you don't have to worry about it being too large or too small. And the forward grip is basically just the pole part of the saw with some rubberized foam that has been well wrapped around it, which is completely fine, and I don't really have any complaints about. Just don't leave it out in the sun if you don't want it to deteriorate, but that pretty much goes with anything made out of foam or plastic. So there really is nothing majorly wrong here, and everything gets a pass. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the trigger and safety. Now the trigger and safety, like on most pole saws and chainsaws, are integrated so that you always have to press the safety first before pressing the trigger, and well, that's pretty common. Now, the safety on this particular tool is made out of plastic, just like the trigger, and you will only be able to press it from the left side of the tool. There is no access to the safety from the right side, so, well, if you are have a preference on which side you push the safety from, well, you're out of luck with this particular tool. Now, when it comes to the trigger, you basically have to pull the trigger all the way in before the motor will become activated, and you only have one speed to work with. Sorry, there is no variable speed on this particular pole saw. Everything here is fairly basic and nothing special, and honestly, there's nothing else to say. They get the job done, and that's about it. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the extension lock. The extension lock is going to be the piece you'll turn in order to extend or retract the extension arm piece, and well, quite frankly, everything here is fairly basic. You simply twist it to loosen it, and then once you have the desired length, you will simply tighten it again. It's made out of plastic, and that's about the sum of it. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about this particular tool's length and the usability and probably its biggest shortcoming. Now, this particular tool is made out of, I believe, a fiberglass resin, although I'm not 100% sure on that. I wasn't able to find any details about what it was actually made of, and this is just an educated guess. And the length of the tool is of the advertised 9.5 feet, which is going to be good for anyone who's ever been shortchanged by a product description. But at the same time, using it at the fully extended length of 9.5 feet is not the best user experience in the whole world. And what I mean by that is, well, because of how heavy the end is, and the fact that the material that they decided to go with is a little bit more flexible to prevent breakages and to make sure that you didn't have any sort of permanent bend that you couldn't get out of it, this kind of means that it's kind of jello-y or flexible or flops around like a fish. And it's not going to be the easiest tool to work with when it's fully extended, unfortunately. There's just a lot of flexible bowing or bending that is taking place when you have it fully extended and you're holding it by one end. And this can be definitely irritating when you're trying to be precise and you're trying to cut a particular branch and not damage anything else. Or if you just don't have a lot of upper body strength to continuously hold the tool upward for long periods of time to try to get to exactly where you need it to be. Honestly, I really would have liked to have seen a slightly more rigid construction method used on this particular tool, but that's not what we were given, so we'll just have to make do with what we have. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the Sling Mount. The Sling Mount is located slightly forward of the forward grip and will allow you to, well, use the included sling, which is a nice, well, little feature and not something that a lot of brands actually do anymore, which is a disappointment. So I'm glad that they include one. It is a cheap one like I mentioned earlier, but you can actually adjust it forward or backwards by loosening the Phillips head screw on the Sling Mount. So quite frankly, everything here is, well, completely satisfactory, and while not the best in the world, it is nice that it was included. moving on. Okay, next up we have the connector lock. Now the connector lock is another plastic red sleeve which will screw onto the saw portion of the pole saw in order to lock it into place. Everything here works as intended and I don't have any complaints. It's easy to turn, and once you have it in the locked or secured position, it's not going to easily adjust itself. So really nothing to complain about here. The one thing I would change is to make it so that you don't always have to extend the pole part of the saw from the base piece, because if it's retracted all the way, you're going to have a hard time, unscrewing or connecting the connector piece for the pole saw portion of the tool. So yeah, that'd be the only thing I would change, and honestly, it's not really anything to even really, worth complaining about. So everything here gets a pass. Okay, next up we have a plastic hook that you can use in order to pull down branches that you've already cut that might have gotten snagged on other branches that are in the tree. It's a nice little feature and it does come in handy, and I've used it several times, so I'm glad they included it. Moving on. And next up we have the bar oil tank. Now the bar oil tank is adequate. It's like pretty much every other bar oil tank on any other pruning saw or chainsaw. It will self-administer its own oil to the saw so you don't have to prime it. And when you need to store the tool, you will have to drain the oil out of the tank each and every time, because it will leak out through the cap regardless of how tight you have it, or it will leak out through the oiling point on the blade. So everything here is an average design. I really wish they would come up with a better design for chainsaws and pole saws when it comes to the oiling system, but until then, everything here is average. Okay, next up we have the toolless chain tensioning system, as well as the bar cover or clutch cover, whatever you want to call it. Quite frankly, everything here works fine, and I'm happy to say that I didn't have any issues like I did with the Ryobi toolless chain tensioning system on the pruning saw I reviewed a couple weeks ago. This particular chain tensioning system is completely adequate. It will keep the chain in place right where it's supposed to be, and it allows you to have easy access to tensioning or loosening the chain, or just, removing the cover completely to do basic cleaning and maintenance, or if you just need to replace the bar or chain for some strange reason. Quite frankly, everything here works as intended, and I don't really think there's anything majorly wrong to complain about. The cover itself is made out of plastic, but all the little parts and nuts and stuff that you need to attach it to the pole saw are made out of metal. The knobs are also made out of plastic, but they're nice and large and easy to grip, and so you don't have to worry about some sort of fiddly flip out grip or anything like you would on the Ryobi that I reviewed a couple weeks ago. If you can't tell, that one kind of pissed me off. So honestly, this particular pole saw's chain tensioning system is really good. As a matter of fact, it's almost eerily identical to the Black & Decker 10-inch chainsaw I reviewed a couple months ago. Wonder why that would be. It's almost as if that they were made by the same company. But that couldn't be. Could it? I don't know. But moving on, this particular chain tensioning system is very effective, and I don't have any complaints. So as far as I'm concerned, everything here gets a pass. Okay, last but not least, we have the bar, chain, and sheath. And, quite frankly, everything here is an acceptable-ish showing, except for the sheath. Now, the bar on this particular chainsaw is going to be about 7.5 inches long, or that's how much usable space you have, which is a little bit short of the 8-inch mark, but it does take an 8-inch chain, so that legally they could probably get away with that in the marketing. But for usable space for the user, you have about 7.5 inches of cutting room on the bar. Now, when it comes to the chain seems like a decent quality chain, although there's probably better chains on the market that will last longer. But the include one, it works just fine. And when it comes to the sheath, it's an absolute complete failure of a sheath, which will fall off, and I don't trust at all. The only thing it's good for is to, hide the chain while you're storing it. If you keep it on while you're walking, you are going to lose it. So the sheath is complete failure, and the chain is acceptable, and the bar is slightly shorter than 8 inches, but still in an acceptable range. And that's about the sum of it. Let's go ahead and talk about this particular tool in use. I did not weigh this particular tool because I did not have a good way of doing that. So yeah, moving on. Okay. Let's go ahead and talk about this particular pole saw in use. It is acceptable. There are definitely a lot of things going against it, however. One would be how much weight is on the front end, but that's pretty much common for pretty much any pole saw. And the other thing would be, honestly, the flexibility of the pole itself. The pole on this particular pole saw flexes so much that it just makes getting to the branch that you want to cut kind of an absolute chore, and it definitely is not the best user experience in the whole wide world. I really wish that the pole on this particular pole saw was much more rigid. That would definitely give you a much better user experience, and it would help you, well, complete your cuts quicker, faster, and more efficiently. With this particular pole saw, the weight changes because of the flexible nature of the pole, so where you're trying to aim, you have to readjust, and you have to adjust again, and then adjust a third time in order to get the pole exactly where you need it. And you have to do so carefully in order to, well, not snap the pole, or to drop the pole, or if you're working on top of a ladder, not to fall off the ladder and do something incredibly stupid. So quite frankly, there are a lot of things that are also going against this particular pole saw. But don't get me wrong, for the price point, it's an acceptable performance, and my main complaints here are not necessarily only affecting this particular pole saw. Honestly, there's quite a debate to be had about whether or not motorized pole saws are better than a regular pole saw. True, they are quicker, but with a regular pole saw without a motor, you can usually add more extension pieces or poles in order to make it taller, so you don't even need to get a ladder out if you have enough extension pieces. So there is a debate to be had there. I think if you're older, this is definitely a tool to avoid simply because of the awkward nature and how heavy the end is. There are exceptions to that rule, but I think for the average person, they're going to be unhappy with this particular pole saw if they don't know what they're getting into. But for me personally, it still has a place in my arsenal of tools. It just isn't going to be the tool that I'm always going to be looking forward to using. It's more of a dreaded tool to have to use rather than a tool that I look forward to using. So yeah, let's go ahead and recap with the pros and cons. Okay, first up we have 20 volt. 20 volt means that this will work with all your hyper-tough lithium 20 volt batteries, and you can adapt batteries over from other brands via third-party adapter. Just be aware, if you do that, you do that at your own risk. Toolless. Overall, the chain tensioning system is very nice since it is toolless and you won't have to worry about losing wrenches. So as far as I'm concerned, the toolless system is a pro. Strap. The fact that they include a strap at the price point that this particular pole saw is being sold at is a very nice feature, and I'm very glad that they included it. So as far as I'm concerned, this is a pro in my opinion. Price. Overall, the price on this particular pole saw is $98 currently, and that's a fairly good price as of the recording of this video. So as far as I'm concerned, this is a pro. Battery life. Overall, the battery life was fairly good with the 1.5 amp hour battery I was using with. I was able to complete around 20 decent cuts, and I still had battery life left over. So as far as I'm concerned, the battery life is a pro on this particular saw. Hook. The hook actually really does come in handy, and I'm glad that it was included. It is a nice little afterthought, and it is helpful when you are trying to pull down a branch that just won't come down. And the first meh would be the front weight. Honestly, this is a problem that pretty much all motorized pole saws suffer from, and so I really can't hold it against this particular pole saw in general, but the front weight on this pole saw is on the heavy side, so that is just something that you need to be aware of if you have any sort of loss of upper body strength due to age, injury, or just never had it to begin with. Kind of like me. Moving on. Not rigid. The pole section of this particular pole saw is very flexible, and this is definitely not a great user experience. If the pole had been much more rigid, this would be a far easier tool to recommend, but because of the flexibility, it definitely makes it a harder tool to recommend. Moving on. Fixed head. There are pole saws on the market that have an adjustable head, and this can be useful in certain situations. While this isn't the biggest con in the world, it would have been nice to have a little bit more adjustability when it comes to the head of this particular tool. And the last con would be that the sheath falls off. Pretty self-explanatory. It's definitely a con. Moving on. Okay, and that is it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this particular tool. Honestly, it's a good option for people who are on a budget, but if you do have the extra money and you can buy something that has a little bit more rigidity, that would be the route I would go. For me personally, I don't have a lot of trees that I have to keep maintenance up on, so this is going to work just fine for me. But if you are somebody that lives in a more tree abundant area, I would highly recommend maybe taking a look at something that has a little bit more rigidity to it, and maybe even consider a manual pole saw and get some exercise while you're doing your work. But for me personally, this will do. So yeah, this tool comes recommended for us cheapskates. And that is it for this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe, and we will see you next time. God bless.